Siri. My name is Raina McClure and you're watching PoliSci 4420. This week, Apple Corporations reported that they had seen their first quarterly revenue decline in 4 years, blaming unfavorable exchange rates for their pitfall. Apple is not the only multinational corporation reporting decreases in their revenue. 55% of companies with most of their sales in the United States have reported seeing a drop in revenue, which is predicted to account for 3% drop overall by the end of this year. Most companies blame the strength of the United States' dollar. However, this is a phenomenon that has been perplexing and creating conversations among economists for decades. But what does this all mean? This is the part of the show where I like to introduce a segment called Econ for Dummies. While this might sound a little bit derogatory in classes, this segment is simply to help those who are new to economic historical discussions and don't understand basic terminology or debates. To begin understanding exchange rates, you need to first know that the United States carries what is known as a floating exchange rate within the international market. This means that when companies trade with the United States, there are no limits on how their currency travels or how it is valued. There is no consistent peg. Whereas countries like China maintain a fixed exchange rate and always peg their currency. Pegging currency means that currency is always set to the same exact value as another nation's. This is not the type of exchange rate the United States has or members of the EU. We float our exchange rate, meaning that when we buy products in the international market, the value of our dollar compared to another country's dollar is constantly changing. For instance, have you ever found a peso as you're anxiously digging through your car looking for that 7 cents that you need to pay the tax on your dollar soda at McDonald's? But the line is not going a lot quicker than you thought. So you aggressively throw it somewhere in your car where it'll never see the light of day again because you think it's worth absolutely nothing? Well, that peso is worth something, and the value of that peso in the United States' dollars is constantly changing. The exchange rate for currency is almost never 1-to-1. For example, that peso is actually currently worth a nickel and a half, whereas in 2020, it wasn't worth the nickel, but only 4 pennies. This is the effect of a floating exchange rate. The value of currency is constantly changing, and this is what these huge multinational corporations are complaining about. A recent issue with exchange rates happened this past summer, where the exchange rate for the euro was set at a ratio of 1-to-1, making it less expensive for Americans to import goods from Europe. The US dollar stretched further. However, now it requires about $1.10 to account for 1 singular euro. This is bad because it represents a claim made by these multinational corporations that invest in the United States. The United States' strength of the dollar is depreciating the revenue. You could simply ask, why doesn't the United States just weaken the dollar? See, the United States is and has been in a trade deficit for years. We aim to be an export-oriented nation, but we just constantly fail to export more than we import. It's kind of like New Year's resolutions, where you swear you're going to do them, but there's always something holding you back. Like mine was to go to the gym, and instead I rewatched The Vampire Diaries for the 8th time and got takeout from Lost Marks. Well, the United States' New Year's resolution is constantly to maintain a weaker currency so that export-oriented companies benefit more, as well as the United States' economy. If our dollar is worth less than a euro, the United States will see a sudden influx of purchases made overseas, as Europe did over this past summer when the currency value ratio was 1-to-1. However, currently the United States has a strong currency that maximizes our purchasing power and a floating exchange rate that allows us to use monetary policy to maintain our domestic economy. But most companies like Apple want the United States' dollar to be weaker and stable so that their goods are more attractive to consumers. So to quickly summarize, essentially a strong dollar is good for imports and bad for exports, while a weak dollar is good for exports and bad for imports. You would think over time, knowing that this is an issue facing multinational corporations investing in America, that there would be efforts to weaken the US dollar. Instead, it has gotten stronger. Why is that? The reason that the US dollar has gotten stronger recently is because the US Federal Reserve has increased exchange rates to combat the high inflation. Central banks in Europe didn't increase their rates as much as the United States banks did. See, in 2022, the Federal Reserve raised its key fundamental rates 7 times, something that hasn't been done so aggressively since the 1980s. It hopes by doing this, it can slow down the economy. See, banks need to borrow money too. So they borrow from the Federal Reserve, and there's interest rates placed on these loans. These interest rates are passed on to local bank customers when they go to take bank loans from them. Only they're increased by a certain percentage so that the banks continue to earn profits. The theory is that people will spend less if there is an incentive not to, like high interest rates, thereby decreasing inflation. It's like when you've been online shopping for hours and you go to checkout and you see that $5.95 shipping cost. It makes you suddenly forget what you're even buying. Well, that is the goal of these banks. It's hoping to discourage people from buying goods and taking out loans in order to combat inflation. However, in return, it's creating a strong dollar, which is in fact further contributing to the United States' long, fiery battle with its trade deficit, creating the complaints that we hear from these multinational corporations, as now people or countries have no incentive to purchase from United States companies. This is a long, overworked explanation of all the dynamics that go to in explaining multinational corporation and complaints. It honestly probably sounded like a Theo Von podcast with how over the place it was, but ultimately, I hope you learned something. This is Raina McClure. Stay classy, Columbia.